know what we need.
And this is this week's Classic Classic.
Hi, welcome to Turntable. I'm Richie Sarno, and my guest tonight is author Earls, who has written a couple of books that was published by Arcadia Publishing. One of them is on Route 128, the birth of the age of high tech and digital equipment corporation. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard.
And for a second there, I thought I was going to turn into Rod Serling and start introducing an episode of Twilight Zone the way I was going there. But our association actually goes back about 17 years, if you can believe that now. Back when we worked for Mass High Tech newspaper, published by Doug Green at the time.
Correct.
And you were the editor of Mass High Tech.
That's right.
And how long did you hold that position for?
Does sound like Twilight Zone, doesn't it?
It does.
I was with Mass High Tech for a total of 6 or 7 years. I've forgotten the exact number.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is, I guess you could say, the germ of where this book came from.
Right. As I was going through the books, I remembered a lot of the pictures that ran in the paper, and brought back a lot of memories from those days. And
yeah, the archives of the Mass High Tech were very helpful in putting the book together, as a matter of fact. I guess it probably goes back. Working at Mass High Tech gave me a chance to learn more about this road that I'd been acquainted with since I was a little kid. I grew up in Waltham and then later on in Wayland. And when I was a 4 or 5 year old, there wasn't as much traffic then as there is now. And 128 was the place folks took you on the weekends to go to the North Shore, or if you were lucky enough to go to Pleasure Island or something like that up in Wakefield. And of course, I also became more aware of it as an important part of the grown-up world, because my dad worked at some of the companies that were on 128 back then. He was an engineer at some of the early high-tech companies. So when I was working at Mass High Tech in the 1980s and watching this second generation growth of high-tech companies around Route 128, I got really, really interested in a lot of the stories of how that had all come to pass, and sort of put aside this idea of eventually perhaps doing a book on this. Some other folks did some more scholarly books over the years on Route 128, really looking at individual businesses in a very detailed way, and looking at how they came to do what they did. I wanted to make something that was more accessible, and that people who had driven the road or worked at the companies and just wanted to get a feel for the history could enjoy.
Well, at one time, people considered Route 128, they called it the road to nowhere.
That's right.
Before it became America's high technology highway.
That's right, and that's really funny, because I think one of the reasons that moniker was briefly applied to it was because the idea of having a beltway around a big city was really new. Depending who you talk to, we were either the first or the second beltway anywhere in the U.S. So the idea of running this road through these cornfields and these quiet little rural towns like Burlington didn't seem to make a lot of sense to people initially, and even the planners didn't really realize how successful it would be. Today we're living with the fact that 128 was so successful. It attracted business, and it attracted more homeowners and more business, and now we have perpetual traffic, but it wasn't always intended to be that.
Mm-hmm. Did it actually emerge as America's technology highway, or did it fall short of their expectations?
Absolutely, it did. It wasn't intended as that. That's an interesting thing. As I mentioned, the real goal was just to provide a way to get from the north side of Boston to the south side, because Boston's famous cow paths were the only way. This was even before there was a central artery. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to get from, say, Braintree or Quincy to Lynn or Swampscott or someplace like that. There was an early Route 128 which went through a lot of what we now call secondary roads through the centers of town. That was the first 128. That was built, or I guess put into existence would be a better word, back in the 1920s. Roads like Lexington Street in Woburn, I think, and Lexington Street in Waltham were Route 128 at one time. And then in the 1930s, some folks like William Callahan, who also helped build the Callahan Tunnel, named after his son, and the Turnpike, started pushing this idea of building 128. And actually, I believe some of the construction got started before World War II. And as you may have noticed, I know WCVB did a segment a couple of years ago celebrating the 50th anniversary of the opening of most of the road. That was in 1952. And then from there, again, as I said, it wasn't really planned, but companies started to say, you know, there's land out there that's not too expensive. Why don't we locate a facility out there? Homeowners, especially folks on the GI Bill, started coming out and buying Cape Cod homes and ranches, and one thing led to another.
Yeah.
High tech happened to be starting to grow, and it was a perfect place for it. Greater Boston had the universities and a lot of talented people, and in the 50s, this really was the Silicon Valley of the United States. A lot of the first transistor and semiconductor companies were right here. In fact, my dad worked at one. It wasn't right on 128. It was initially in downtown Waltham in an old factory building, but it later moved out to fancy new headquarters along 128. And to answer your question, I think I veered off a little bit. For various reasons, other areas began to exceed 128 in their growth. Silicon Valley is the most famous. The growth there just kept going and going and going for various reasons. They latched onto some technologies that were perhaps more crucial than the ones that were here and ended up being more important. And some would argue that some of the business conditions were better there. The business people would complain that it was Massachusetts back then. It was hard to expand, and there was less available land, and a lot of other things like that kept Route 128 from growing as far. But it's still a really important area. There's still an awful lot of important companies here, and a lot of employment for folks, a lot of new ideas.
And do we see it building back up even more so, even though the economy in this situation there?
That's a good question. You know, 10 or 20 years ago when we were both at Mass High Tech, the business folks were the people that complained about costs. They still complain about costs, but now it's homeowners. Every average day folks who look at Massachusetts and say, oh, this is a high-cost place. It's very hard for companies to recruit younger people who don't already have a home, because it's very hard to buy a home here, as everyone knows. It's just outrageously expensive. So that's probably one of the principal reasons that growth may be constrained around here for the foreseeable future. But again, the fundamental things that help grow companies, those things are still happening here. The universities and colleges and the existing network of advanced companies. Raytheon, for example, has been around since the 1920s, creating all kinds of new products, new generations. They were creating, you know, the high-tech radios of the 1930s, and then radar and things like that for the government during World War II, and radar ranges in the 50s and 60s, and those things continue.
Yeah, would you say that the best years of 128 are behind them?
Well, let's say it was a golden age, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, it was the best. A nice balance of growth. It was a time of optimism, and the companies thought the sky was the limit. Now there's a whole lot more competition out there, but it's certainly not the end of the story, I don't think.
Probably not. So, how did you come to go to Arcadia Publishing? How did that all develop of your book, Route 128?
Actually, about 3 years ago, I happened to have bought a book on the town I was born in, which is Southbridge, Massachusetts, out in the central part of the state. And I looked at it and thought, this is a really nice format, and I wonder if these folks would be interested in a book on 128. So
That's
I read
right,
them a
yeah.
proposal.
Arcadia Publishing does a series of books. Many people have seen them at Barnes & Noble here in Burlington.
Sure.
On the various towns and cities throughout
Yeah.
Massachusetts. I was born and raised in Cambridge. I have the one on Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, is this part of that series in a sense?
I think it's a related series.
Related
I'm not sure if it's
series, right.
exactly the same. They call it the Images of America series. It's
Images of America, yeah.
almost the same.
Yeah. And and the book is done well. What I liked about going through it is it's very intensive with photographs and captions,
Right.
Which is enjoyable to go through, and it's good, easy reading for
Right.
people to be familiar with learning about 128 without it being too.
Yeah, and in gathering the photos, I really tried to have a nice mix of some folks working, building computers or things like that, and executives or famous politicians or familiar buildings. So you do get kind of that nice spectrum of things to look at.
Right. Now, you were also the editor and publisher of Industry Magazine for
That's
a while.
right. Yep, that was put out by the Associated Industries of Massachusetts. It was a monthly business magazine for the state. So I've been sort of snooping around this whole Massachusetts business stuff for quite a while.
Right. Well, you certainly have the background and the expertise of many years of the high-tech industry between Mass High Tech and Industry Magazine. And right now you have your own business as a...
I'm a freelance writer. I do a lot
writer.
of writing for business and computer publications, national publications in most cases, and sometimes clients who need me to write something else.
You've also written for the Boston Globe and
Yeah,
Chicago
I contribute to
Tribune,
the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, occasionally San Jose Mercury, and Christian Science Monitor, but mostly what I write is business-related stuff for the business periodicals.
Okay, and tell us a little bit about the beginning of the high-tech industry as we know it in this area.
Sure. Well, I think if you go back far enough, you can say that this area has always been sort of high-tech. We were one of the oldest parts of the country, and the area has always had a very entrepreneurial culture with people willing to try new things, whether it was clipper ships to China or around Cape Horn or new ways of manufacturing things. Cities like Lowell that began the Industrial Revolution for America. If you want to go real far back, that's sort of where it began, because we've always had people trying new things and developing more advanced ways of making things or coming up with new inventions. Around the time of World War II, there were already some companies involved with what you might consider high-tech. Baird Atomic was doing things related to nuclear research and medical equipment. Raytheon, as I mentioned, was doing things with radio and later radar, General Radio, and there were several others. But it wasn't real big. I have a study at home that I picked up at a garage sale. It was put up by Harvard University in 1952, I think, and it talks about the future of the New England economy. And there isn't one word about high technology, even electronics, as the future of New England. They were still thinking about reviving the shoe industry or something like that, or maybe foreign trade. So it was a little bit of a surprise, I think, to a lot of people that it grew as much as it did. Part of it was that the American government needed and wanted more high-tech gizmos and gadgets for the Cold War. The space race came along with need for new technologies. And a lot of those things had begun here, and there were people capable of developing them here. So a lot of the early history of high-tech was really defense-related things. And it still is a very big component. MITRE right here on Route 62 is an example of a company that started back in the 1950s specifically for defense work, and it still does that. Things around Hanscom Air Force Base. One of the intriguing things about the story of 128 is the fact that the first semiconductors, the things that are now at the heart of computers and all consumer electronics, were invented and patented and brought to light at Bell Laboratories, announced in 1947, I believe it was. The first actual commercial transistors, though, the first semiconductor products from that invention were manufactured by Raytheon right here in Massachusetts. And there were a whole host of other companies, Clevite, Unitrode, Sprague, Transitron, that were the leaders, Raytheon, in that industry at the time. I'm not really sure exactly what the sequence was that led them to not dominate the industry and for this not to become Silicon Valley, but it may have been that the invention of the next breakthrough, the integrated circuit, happened elsewhere, and other companies leaped ahead with that, way ahead of the first sort of generation of semiconductor companies. But every time I hear people talk about Silicon Valley, I always think with a little local pride, well, it started here.
It started here, right? And I mean, we were big, and we're still big.
Yeah, well, there's still a lot of very important companies here. In the 1980s and 70s, we were really spoiled by having companies that dominated the industry, or at least large parts of the industry. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation that were just growing by leaps and bounds. They were almost household words, at least in business and industry, they were household words. And we don't really have that as much now. We have some pretty well-known software companies and some biomedical companies that are very important, and a few other companies that are very important, but we don't quite have that same position of really leading the industry in a very, very big way that we had some years ago.
Yeah, who are some of the top companies that we have around here right now?
Well, there are a lot of smaller companies. Progress Software is one that comes to mind. They're close by here. Pretty big software company, but again, it's not like a Microsoft type company, not even in the same league by a long shot. So it's a very different environment right now, but that could change. The technology industry changes all the time, as you know, and the people on top today may not be on top in 10 years from now.
Now you brought, we have some pictures to look at from the book.
Yeah, of the Digital Equipment Corporation book, which is the second book. I got going on that just about a year ago.
Okay.
That was kind of a sad story because Digital had a tremendous archive when they were in existence here locally, but when they got purchased by Hewlett Compaq and then Hewlett Packard, a lot of that stuff just got squirreled away or lost, or I think some of it ended up in a museum out in California. But I was fortunate enough to get in touch with the founder's assistant, Ann Jenkins. She worked with Ken Olsen for many, many years, and she gave me access to a really nice collection of photographs, which is what we have here.
Now, Ken Olsen founded the company in 1957.
That's right. And the really amazing thing is that he did it with just $70,000 in venture capital, which is like, that's a big lunch for your investors these days. Not venture capital in current terms.
Well, we got some pictures here, so why don't we talk about them?
Sure. Now these pictures are all of Digital, but they're from a chapter on Digital in my Route 128 book. I didn't bring the images of the Digital book, but they're similar and a lot more of them. This is, excuse me, this is me clearing my throat. This is Gordon Bell on the left, who was one of the most influential people at Digital, and he now actually works at Microsoft, speaking of Microsoft. This is around 1964, 65, with, I think that's Alan Kotok on the right, with the PDP-6 computer, one of Digital's early, somewhat bigger computers. I think this is the machine, or at least the monitor, on which the first computer video game was ever played, called Space Wars, a few years before this. This gives you, this is one of my favorite photos because it really looks like the 1960s and was real typical of the time. And this is, I think right around in the middle of the photo, there's Ken Olsen and a whole bunch of folks from Digital on a rainy day in Maynard having a good softball game after work. I guess high tech was sometimes fun in games as well as being lots of hard work. And this is a really momentous day for Digital when they went public. I think the year is 1969, I'll have to double check that. Excuse me, that's Ken Olsen standing at the center. And this is about 10 years later in the late 70s. Governor Mike Dukakis there is shoveling some dirt out of the way for Ken Olsen to build another building. I think it was their semiconductor site in Hudson.
He was a larger-than-life character. I mean, he was...
Olsen or
Olsen,
Dukakis?
Yeah.
They both were
Either
in their
one,
own
I
ways.
suppose.
Yeah. Yes, he really was. I think mostly well-loved, although there were people who take issue with some of the ways he ran the company, and of course the fact that the company isn't here anymore doesn't help either. There's Gordon Bell in the foreground and Olsen in the background with their VAX computer, which was a pretty revolutionary mid-size, large mini-computer from the 1980s that propelled Digital for about 10 or 15 years. Very important device that people thought it was going to take them up against IBM for a while. And this is one of Digital's, alas, unsuccessful forays into personal computing. If you go back far enough, they really, in some sense, invented personal computing because they made computing very affordable. Small businesses, at least, could afford a computer. And unfortunately, other folks like IBM and Apple really got the idea of taking computers to the masses. But this was one of Digital's attempts at coming up with a personal computer in the early 1980s. And this is when Ronald Reagan came to town to visit the Digital facility in Boston. And that's, of course, Ken Olsen on the right. and there's Ken Olson in the mid-'80s looking confident after an annual meeting. I guess he didn't know there were more stormy days ahead, but at that time, digital was really riding high. He was named America's most successful entrepreneur around that time by Fortune magazine, I think it was, and that really says just how successful the region was thanks to folks like him.
Well, that was a very nice journey through there. And like I said, there's many more pictures like that in the books.
Many more.
And
yes.
So how did the book Digital take shape, and why, really?
Well,
why Digital Equipment Corporation as opposed to?
In my Route 128 book, I put in a chapter on digital, and I think at the beginning of the chapter I mentioned that digital was in some ways not representative of the high-tech industry because it was so successful, but it was the company everyone measured themselves against. Raytheon had been around for a while, but digital was one of the new startups of the 128 era, 1957. And right from the start, it took off. They were profitable very quickly, and they grew and grew and grew and grew. So everyone wanted to be the next digital. The Data General wanted to do it, Wang wanted to do it, Prime wanted to do it, and to some extent they succeeded. So it really was sort of the bellwether company for the Route 128 high-tech period. It started pretty much with the road, and even though it was located primarily not on 128, but near 128, it really was kind of the 128 company.
Right, they were in Maynard.
That was their headquarters in the famous old mill building, and they had operations in Bedford and Lexington and just about everywhere else, but that was their headquarters.
Yeah, well, actually, they were worldwide.
Very much so, yeah. They went from 3 or 4 employees to 120 or 130,000, from $70,000 to a valuation of 12 or 13 billion. It's a heck of a story. So it just seemed like the logical next step to go from writing about 128 to writing about its most famous company.
So it's like a companion publication.
And I'm in the process of expanding this companionship. I've got a couple of other, actually 3 other related titles in the works. I'm writing a book on the U.S. Army Natick Laboratory out in Natick, which is one of those little-known places that has done really, really interesting things for the Army and for consumers too. They invented a lot of things we take for granted. Don't ask me to name any of the second. A lot. You'll have to buy the book, I guess. And I'm also working with the archivist from Raytheon on a book about Raytheon, and with the archivist from Polaroid on a book about Polaroid. And there may be some books beyond that, but there's a lot of really interesting history, and it's really attractive to me, so I keep writing.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's great. It's a fine job you've done. There must be some wild or interesting stories that have taken place either with Digital Equipment Corporation or some of the other companies.
There are. In this book, there's one photo that's very interesting. It predates the completion of 128, but it's the first computer bug. Mm-hmm. At least arguably. Harvard had invented Howard Aiken, one of Harvard's researchers, had invented a very early computer, and in 1945 this big room-filling machine full of tubes and wires and relays and so on stopped working, and when they went to find out why, they found this little moth stuck between two in a switch, electrocuted, and that's what it stopped the computer.
Really there was
it really was a computer bug, and they preserved it, and it's now in some museum that the Navy funds, because I think it was done with Navy money, so they claim credit to having the first computer bug. I guess they didn't stop it from reproducing. That's the problem.
Well, without mentioning any names, we seem to recall a place that we used to frequent at a bakery that.
Oh, yes, right.
It's similar.
A great office to be in. That's one of the interesting small stories. And as far as the highway itself, after the book came out, a fellow who I think his father was involved in helping to open the road, I think he was a state official, told me a really fun story about the opening day in 1952, maybe in Danvers, I'm not sure exactly which town. William Callahan or the local dignitaries had wanted to open 128 with a splash, so they hired some circus elephants to come lead the parade of cars down the first section of highway. It was a hot, hot day, and the elephants said, I'm not walking on that stuff. So they had to cancel that part of it and reorient their opening ceremony a little bit without elephants.
Well, as I said, it brought back memories to me, certainly, and some of the people that are featured in the book, like William Foster, Stratus Corporation.
Sure. Yeah, the famous teddy bear shot. He had a talking teddy bear in his office that would say nice things to him, like, "You're the greatest CEO ever," and pull a little ring and it would say,
Did he really?
"Yeah, you deserve a promotion," or whatever. So I thought that was a nice touch.
Were there any other interesting characters that headed companies?
Oh, they were all interesting, it seems like. There's one photograph of Bernie Gordon, who's still actively involved with Analogic on the North Shore. Very colorful, opinionated fellow.
That's up in Peabody, is that
Yes, in
correct?
Peabody.
Yeah.
He was involved. He actually worked for the first manufacturer of computers, which wasn't here. It was down in the Philadelphia area, the Eckert-Mockley Computer Company, which became the Univac Company. He was one of the first 5 or 6 employees there to actually be involved in manufacturing computers, which no one had done up to that point. But here in Massachusetts, he has been involved with Analogic, his company, and a couple of predecessor firms. Created technology that we use all the time in this studio, in our home electronics, the conversion of analog signals, things like our voices, to digital signals that we can now put on CD-ROMs or into DVDs. His company invented some of the first machines that did that. They were probably as big as this desk, and they weren't very pretty to look at, but without those pioneers, we probably wouldn't have the kind of technology we all take for granted now. So that's, and he's an interesting fellow in his own right. He's, I think, in his 70s now, and he's still extremely physically fit and extremely opinionated, and runs his company his way. But that sort of founding generation, I think, was particularly colorful. And Raytheon had some really interesting executives in its day. Lawrence Marshall was their president for many years in the 1930s and 1940s. And he had a pretty simple management philosophy, which was embodied in a very, very simple book. He had on the side table in his office a copy of The Little Engine That Could. And when engineers would come in and say, "Well, we can't because of this, we can't because of that," he'd just point at this book. And they were supposed to get the point. You find a way and make it happen.
And I'm sure they did
And
get
they
the
did.
point.
They did.
They did. Somebody I remember that got a lot of press at the time was Barbara Anderson.
Yes. Yes.
And, enlighten us a little bit about her. She was a very colorful
She was very
driving
colorful.
force.
Not specifically a high-tech person. She was involved with Citizens for Limited Taxation back in the early 1980s. But she teamed up with the Mass High-Tech Council to support things like Proposition 2.5 and to try to make Massachusetts more business-friendly. And obviously, people have different opinions about whether that was a good thing or bad thing. But high-tech and Barbara Anderson really kind of shook the state of politics here in Massachusetts. And many things did change, and arguably, I think it did make Massachusetts a little bit more of a business-friendly sort of state. As I said, you don't hear the business people complaining as loudly as they did 20 years ago about Massachusetts not being a good place to do business. It's the rest of us who now have problems with Massachusetts being hard to be in. But yes, she's a very, very dynamic person, still involved with those things, but not carrying the red banner, I guess, quite as much as she was 20 years ago.
Sure. Now, Ken Olson basically folded shop. Well, he left the company in the 90s. Sort of
early
abruptly, or whatever,
1990s, yeah.
and started another company.
He did start another company called Modular Computer, which lasted for a few years. I think it may still exist in some small form, but he's, I think, fundamentally retired, you would say.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other, I think Ed DeCastro of Data General is also retired. He did help me track down one image for the Route 128 book. And parts of his company exist within what's now EMC out in Hopkinton,
Mm-hmm.
the big company that handles computer storage and things like that for big companies.
I think we're winding down time-wise on the show.
Great.
Any closing feelings about high-tech and where we're looking in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, it's a very interesting time. I think one of the speaking about folks like you and I who live in the suburbs of Boston, I think there's going to be some big changes because there's just an article in the Sunday Globe this week about the fact there's such a high ratio of folks over 65 to under 18 in the towns right around 128. I think that will probably change as the generations shift over the next 10 or 15 years, and that may change a lot of things about the region's attractiveness and its ability to grow and attract new graduates with new ideas and the people that will build the next generation of high technology.
Sounds great. Well, the books again are from Arcadia Publishing. They're out of Portsmouth.
They have a regional headquarters in Portsmouth. They're actually headquartered in South Carolina.
Okay, and it's part of the Images of America series. And the two books are Route 128 and The Birth of the Age of High Tech. And the other one is Digital Equipment Corporation. And I thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And
a lot of fun to talk about the old times.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we'll have you back again sometime.
Great. Terrific.
Southern New Hampshire University.
Thornhill College.
Middlesex Community College. McGill University.
Wheelock College.
Maine College of Art.
WPI.
Boston College.
Cambridge College.
Dartmouth College.
The University of Vermont.